Hey everyone, welcome to my Mindthief video guide. Now, I'm aware I'm very late to the party. There are many Mindthief guides already out there. This guide, however, will focus more on Mindthief specific play tips as opposed to card selection choices. The other guides out there are complementary to this, so I actually recommend reading up on them before watching this. Of particular note are Gripeaway's Imager Guide, which is incredibly humorous, and Suruki23's Imageless Guide, which contains a wealth of card ratings and reviews specific to different Mindthief archetypes. Speaking of archetypes, there are lots of different ways to play the Mindthief. The name itself speaks to this. You can play a Mindthief that controls the actions of allies and enemies alike, or you can play a Mind Thief that scurries around with superior initiative, snatching up every last piece of loot. Or you could mess around with the augment mechanic unique to this class, switching augments up as the winds of battle shift. In this video, we will not touch on any of those at all. Instead, we'll focus on the playstyle I used in my campaign run as the Mindthief, the Psionic Warrior and Frost Mage, as termed by Suruki23 in the guide. This build excels at dealing decent melee damage whilst keeping enemies disabled. There's merit in different Mindthief builds out there, so I won't attempt to compare my build against the rest, but I will vouch for this build's effectiveness at contributing to team victory through its consistency in dealing damage and crowd control, as well as its lack of reliance on external factors such as scenario layout and team composition. So here are the 10 cards you will bring into battle at level 1 for this build. I'm not going to spend time justifying every single card here. You can read up more on that in the guides I linked to, or simply take my word that these are the best cards for this build. The core of this build consists of the Mind's Weakness, your one true augment that fuels your damage output, as well as your bread and butter combo, Perverse Edge chaining into Frigid Apparition for 2 non-loss stuns. These are staples that will stay with you all the way up to level 9. Here, I'll pay special attention to XP gain because it's the game's way of rewarding you for making good plays. Different classes are rewarded for doing different things. The Tinkerer is rewarded for healing allies, whilst the Spellweaver is rewarded for hitting many targets and consuming elements. As an offensive class, such as the Mindthief, if you look at your non-loss attack cards, including your augments, you realize almost all of them generate experience, unlike most other classes which have more stringent conditions. Given that the majority of these are melee attacks, it is clear that the designer wants to encourage the Mindthief to be in the fray within melee range, and the reward for this is substantial. Because your attacks are non-loss, you can reliably generate 1 experience per turn so long as you're constantly attacking something. This compares very favorably to other classes' XP gain rate, but more importantly, is something to keep in mind when playing the game. You always want to be attacking. To further optimize your experience gain, you want to be consuming ice every time you play Frigid Apparition for the experience gain. You also want to recover your Perverse Edge Frigid Apparition combo with the minor stamina potion in almost every scenario. Most of your XP gain comes from attacks which tend to be top actions, so playing a bottom attack action that generates XP, such as Perverse Edge, allows you to potentially gain more than 1 XP per turn. On the other hand, things to avoid including using lost cards early as well as long resting. Expending lost cards early greatly reduces your longevity. Less time spent in battle means less XP gain. As for long rests, every turn spent not attacking is a turn spent not gaining XP. You want to be opportunistic with gameplay if you want to optimize your XP gain. Towards the end of the game, when the final room has been revealed, you want to be liberal with your lost cards. Every card with a 2 XP symbol remaining in your hand or discard is a wasted opportunity for XP. Most of these lost cards require you to make an attack to gain the XP, but there are a few that are completely unconditional. Brain Leech is one of them. It does not have, or rather it has an attack component, but the heal for self is something you can always perform, and you do gain the experience even if you're already at full health. There's no reason not to play cards like these if you know the scenario is about to end. I haven't seen any other Mindthief guides discuss this important strategy, balancing top and bottom non-loss actions. Every turn, you need to play a pair of cards, one for the top action and one for the bottom. With a starting hand size of 10, it makes sense to have 5 top cards and 5 bottom cards to play in the first pass through your hand, and that's perfectly possible with a level 1 build as illustrated on screen. Recall that in the early stages of the game, we are averse to using loss cards, so the top 5 and the bottom 5 actions are all non-loss. For the top cards, we make a distinction between your augment, the mind's weakness, and the rest of the top actions. This is because recovering augments while resting is optional. This distinction is crucial when balancing top and bottom cards later on. Let's talk resting strategy. Which card to lose on each pass of your hand. After your first pass, you would have played 5 pairs of cards, one of which contains your augment, which is now in your active zone, and it's time to rest before commencing your second pass. Here, it makes sense to keep your augment in play and lose one of your bottom cards to resting. This leaves us with 4 top actions and 4 bottom actions, meaning we can nicely play them in pairs on our second pass, which is ideal. Remember how we strive to only perform short rests as the Mindthief? If we randomize a top action to lose on our first short rest, we likely want to re-roll it. So that is the strategy for the second pass. With the third pass, things get a little tricky because we are going down from hand size 8 to hand size 7, which is an odd number. Odd numbers are bad. By starting a pass with 7 cards, we'll play 3 pairs of cards before finding ourselves with a spare card left dangling in our hand that cannot be played at the end of the pass. What a waste. Fortunately, as the Mindthief, we have a unique way of circumventing this problem, and that is to pick up our augment during the rest, bumping our hand size up to a nice 8 cards. Of course, we try to lose a top action during the rest here to keep our top and bottom cards at a healthy 4 cards apiece. So this is the key to maximizing your longevity. Pulling your augment back to give an even hand size buys you an extra round of play. And by balancing your top and bottom actions, you are maximizing your effectiveness by using the most powerful non-loss actions at your disposal. Past the third round, things become fairly open-ended. Depending on your team's progress through the scenario, you might begin considering using loss cards. An important detail to keep in mind here is that whatever happens, you really cannot afford to lose the mind's weakness during a short rest. Hence, if you're recovering it to make an even hand size, you really should not re-roll the card to lose during the short rest, as it may end up burning your most vital augment. Instead of taking this risk by recovering the mind's weakness, I prefer using exactly 1 card for its loss effect every turn, and then losing 1 card from resting as usual. This means we lose 2 cards per pass, keeping our hand size nice and even without having to remove the mind's weakness from the active zone. Typically, I do so starting from hand size 8. Losing 2 cards means my next pass begins with hand size 6, then hand size 4, then 2, and finally exhausting. But most scenarios typically finish before we get to that point. Now, let's talk damage mitigation. This is one of the most challenging aspects of playing as the Mindthief, because your typical strategies with other classes don't quite apply here. Usually, you move behind your allies to avoid damage or take long rests for the 2 hit point heals. This is unsuitable for Mindthieves because most of your attacks are melee. If you are not upfront dealing damage, you are neither gaining XP nor helping your team out. And as I explained before, we prefer short rests. So, how do we survive? Firstly, positioning is everything. Positioning yourself even a single hex off can have spillover consequences due to monster AI. I can't stress enough how crucial of a factor this is. Manipulating monster AI is key to success. You want to create 1v1 or 1v2 situations as the Mindthief. Reasoning is simple. Almost all your attacks are single target, so you are ineffective against hordes of enemies. Conversely, against a single target, you have an easy time stun locking them with your bread and butter combo. This is why I like starting at the edge of the map in the first room. You can typically be the focus of one or two monsters at the edge closest to you, whilst leaving your teammates to deal with the remainder of the horde. Now let's consider enemy team compositions for a bit. Some groups of enemies consist of a mix of melee and ranged monsters. In such situations, do consider infiltrating to the back line by getting up close and personal with the ranged enemies at the rear. This isn't always the right move, but when done right, it is surprisingly effective. It's important to do so only when the ranged enemy count is low, 1v1 or 1v2 as I said earlier. Doing so draws fire from the archers without changing the melee monster's focus on your teammates. The brute and crackheart in this case draw focus from the melee monsters. This allows the damage from the monsters to be spread across your team, ensuring that none of your teammates get focused down. Additionally, by dispatching the archers quickly, you also mitigate damage, which is very helpful when said ranged enemies have high attack values. Finally, by standing in melee range of the archers, they attack with disadvantage if they draw an attack action with no movement. That's even more damage mitigation. So you see the benefits of infiltrating the back line. But this doesn't apply against melee-only compositions. Instead, you can abuse the invisibility mechanic to block the doorway. Right? This gives the enemies no legal path to your allies, hence rendering them unable to act. In the meantime, your team wails on them at range. The Mindthief, of course, not being short on invisibility cards is an ideal door stopper in this regard. This is a door opening strategy you should always consider in your games. The second tactic in damage mitigation is your crowd control. By disabling enemies that would attack you otherwise, you save yourself the need to heal, effectively reducing the need for healing. I usually prioritize stunning enemies with the bread and butter, perverse edge, and frigid apparition that are focusing me due to the low max HP of the Mindthief. So these crowd control measures are essential when starting a new room, especially the very first room of a scenario, where you are most likely to get swarmed by multiple monsters. The Mindthief takes time to rev up her engine due to the need to get her mind's weakness up in play, so stuns are very helpful with dealing with enemies while preparing your augment. The third tactic is manipulating invisibility and initiative. I assume you're familiar with the technique of effectively having 2 turns of invisibility, achieved by going fast on your invis turn and going slow the turn after. You'll notice that the Mindthief's initiative values are very polarizing. The augments and summons are fairly slow in the 70s to 80s, whilst everything else is blisteringly fast with sub 30 initiative values. This allows you to easily milk lots of time on your invis triggers. The Cloak of Invisibility in particular deserves special mention as a form of invis that can be used reactively when monsters draw an unexpectedly dangerous action card. Having the cloak available acts as a safety net that ensures you from the worst of draws, and as a result should not be expended unless absolutely necessary. Here, I'll give my personal recommendations for skill build, which card to take on level up, and which card from your arsenal to replace, and how your playstyle potentially changes as a result. At level 2, we gain Hostile Takeover. This is a nice long-range disable. The Ice Infusion leaves you net positive with regards to ice generation, which is a really good thing. Because it allows you to support element-hungry classes such as the Spellweaver. Since Hostile Takeover is a top card, it replaces one of our existing top cards, Submissive Affliction. We don't lose out on experience by replacing this, and if we really need a melee attack 2, we can always resolve the default attack 2 using Hostile Takeover instead. The bottom action of Hostile Takeover is effectively a stun that potentially does damage using the monster action deck. It's not something to write home about. The best part of it is gaining 2 XP as a bottom action. Level 3 gives us Brain Leech. Strengthen is a core part of amplifying damage output, as we don't receive any stronger melee attacks until level 6. It also ensures we don't miss our attacks. For this reason, I would also highly recommend Strengthen as an enhancement on Empathetic Assault In fact, your first enhancement, with 2 strengthened cards in play, you will attack with advantage more often than not. Being a bottom card, we replace another bottom card into the knight. Invisibility is a luxury, but I find it possible to get by most scenarios with just the cloak. Level 4 is where your first real decision comes in as the Psionic Warrior and Frost Mage. Initially, I wanted to take Pilfer. It's super cool being able to generate money out of thin air. Once you're done looting enemies, you have a potent bottom action at your disposal. 2 instances of attack 4 factoring in the mind's weakness. Ultimately, I passed on this because it entails replacing an existing top action, which inevitably reduces my damage output. Instead, I took Cranium Overload because the move 5 is a straight up upgrade from the move 4 of Gnawing Horde, which we replace. The top loss action is your first multi-target ability and can potentially yield 3 or more XP. However, its potential is only realized in 4-player games where enemies gather up in bunches more. Level 5 is an easy choice, Mass Hysteria for ranged crowd control plus Ice Infusion. Its role practically overlaps with that of Hostile Takeover, and as such is our target for replacement. It sounds ridiculous to replace our level 2 card with our level 5 card, but we are already flush on Ice generation, and we will lose damage output by replacing any other top action. Level 6! Okay, this is the level we've been waiting for this whole time. We are offered 2 unbelievable choices, Corrupting Embrace and Dark Frenzy. These are the upgrades to our melee damage we've been waiting for since level 1. Unlike the preceding cards, these cards have excellent non-loss actions on both top and bottom, giving us greater flexibility in pairing off our cards. But back to the question, which of the 2 to take? Dark Frenzy has some notable advantages. It gives tons of XP and it does damage in a single hit, making it your card of choice for dealing with shielded enemies you've been struggling against all this while. But only if you can generate darkness. So yes, this decision largely comes down to whether you have access to darkness, since you have no reliable means of generating it yourself. In my playthrough, my Tinkerer ally with Ink Bomb and my Spellweaver ally with Reviving Ether and Chromatic Explosion made the decision to take Dark Frenzy easy. Don't forget the top half of Brain Leech, generates darkness too. Sure, these are all single-use abilities, but even when darkness isn't available, the attack on the bottom action means it still contributes to your damage output. Otherwise, if the sources of darkness just aren't there, go for Corrupting Embrace first, since the bottom action provides the reliable dark generation you seek. Assuming we take Dark Frenzy, the card to replace it is Scurry, because the bottom of Dark Frenzy supersedes it. This means that you lose the ability to move on the same turn as performing a bottom attack such as Perverse Edge or Brain Leech, so be mentally prepared for that. At level 7, we take the card we passed up on level 6. Corrupting Embrace would replace Feedback Loop. Once again, the move 4 jump is superseded with a version that has a status effect that actually triggers semi-reliably, and it also generates darkness to boot. The biggest gameplay change to expect here is the loss of initiative control. Recall we used to be able to choose between throttling our speed and stepping on the gas. With feedback loop removed, we no longer have any slow initiative cards other than the Mind's Weakness, which is more often than not in the active zone anyway. So now we only have one mode. Gotta go fast. We can't really exploit 2 turns of invisibility anymore. Hence, damage mitigation now hinges on your ability to one-hit KO enemies with your more powerful attacks available. Level 7 was when I retired my Mindthief, so everything from this point on is pure theory crafting. Level 8 brings us Shared Nightmare, and I think I would replace Fearsome Blade with it. Gaining more ranged attacks is what we need at this point. Having lost our long invis duration as discussed earlier, I expect we won't be in melee range all the time like before. Even without the augment boost, because it's a ranged attack, attack 3 target 2 on Shared Nightmare is plenty, and the darkness consumption effect is icing on the cake. Finally, at level 9, we obviously take Phantasmal Killer, and it easily supersedes Empathetic Assault if you haven't yet enhanced it for some unfathomable reason. Invisibility is basically damage mitigation, so you don't need the heal 2 anymore. And of course, it leaves you net neutral with regards to darkness generation, granting Dark Frenzy and Shared Nightmare maximum potential. The top half isn't quite usable unless you have a critical mass of darkness enhancements, at which point we are staring down a completely different archetype. So that's the skill build. All that said and done, you'll notice I kept Fearsome Blade longer than in most other recommended builds, all the way up to level 8. Both halves are fantastic for XP gain, with the bottom being an unconditional 2 XP as long as you're not immobilized. The attack 2 is solid since you don't have much better until level 6, and the push is what makes this a Swiss Army knife. Push 1 or push 2 is the market rate, at least among the starter classes, so having push 3 on Fearsome Blade, it is above the curve in that regard. It's not easy to use it to its full potential because there are so many things you can do with it. Let me demonstrate. So revisiting this situation where there is a group of melee and a group of ranged enemies, Fearsome Blade is very flexible. I mean, most players would use Fearsome Blade's push as a way to push monsters into traps, and that certainly is a very effective thing to do. But one other thing you can do if you have infiltrated to the back lines of the melee and ranged enemy group is to use Fearsome Blade to push ranged enemies into the melee fray. Because these ranged enemies will typically keep their distance from the melee enemies, they tend to be unaffected by ranged attacks such as, those dealt by the Crackheart or the Spellweaver. As a backline infiltrator, if you're able to use Fearsome Blade to push enemies into the melee enemies, and that can easily happen because of the powerful push 3, you will not only do some significant damage to them with your attack 2, or rather attack 4 with Mind's Weakness, but it puts these enemies in range of your allies for their ranged attacks, and this is a very good way to dispatch said ranged enemies. Yeah, if you're up against melee, slow-moving enemies instead, such as these golems here, the other thing you can do with Fearsome Blade is to push them out of attack range. Then on their turn, with their slow movement, they will not be able to close the gap, and thus this is another means of damage mitigation with the Mindthief. By using push, that is another way you can create distance between yourself and enemies, thereby meaning that you soak up less damage. And on that note, we'll end off this guide. The Mindthief may seem straightforward to build and execute. Simply play the Mind's Weakness on turn 1 and proceed to knock enemies out like bowling pins. But there are a lot of subtle optimizations you can make to improve your Mindthief play, and I hope this guide has enlightened you to some of them. If you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section, avoiding spoilers as far as possible for everyone's benefit. Till next time, thanks for watching. Goodbye.